areas, both nationally and internationally. And he is also co-lead researcher on the Apartheid Archive project. He is a member of the Academy of Science South Africa and holds a B rating from the National Research Foundation. He currently also serves as the Deputy Dean in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of the Witwatersrand. Thank you so much, Professor Stevens.
Thank you, Hayley, for the warm introduction, and thank you also to Melissa and the Wits Center for Diversity Studies for the invitation to participate in this conference today. My talk this morning is really titled, well, we're getting to afternoon, but titled Race Repetition, Perpetual Paralysis or Paradoxical Promise. And what I'd like to engage with over the next 40 minutes or so are some of the key debates that we've been faced with over the last decade or more about the apparent recalcitrance of race, its recrudescence, and questions as to whether anti-racist theorizing and practice have had any meaningful effect towards a more just and critical humanism, or whether we've simply returned to the vexing challenge of race without any fundamental transformation, in some ways mirroring the question posed by the conference theme around despair versus hope, and the extent to which we can read this history as a linear and progressively unidirectional. Of course, for those of you with whom I've worked, you'll know that my position will be the latter, a call for us all to constantly imagine futures that are yet to unfold through lenses of critical hope. To this end, I'd like to surface three major points. The first is that, Melissa, has that just gone? Has that changed?
Yeah.
Thanks. The first is that we have to offer greater consideration to and deploy our analytical tools more thoughtfully and robustly in the service of understanding the current period in which race seems to have an infinite elasticity, similar to that of capital in many instances. It's not sufficient for us to claim that mainly white working class voters in Europe and the USA today voted more conservatively because they are simply bigoted xenophobes who thumb their noses at the establishment in London, Washington, Paris, or Amsterdam. Nor is it sufficient for us to say that AfriForum in South Africa simply comes to represent those racist whites who are relics of the 20th century under apartheid. Nor that political parties such as the EFF and organizations such as Black First, Land First are merely mobilizing through a racialized agenda for populist political entrepreneurship. Whilst all of these may be partially accurate in some instances, this is not a complete analysis, and we should endeavor to deepen such analytics if we are to truly understand the nature of the historical period in which race is being mobilized, to what ends it is being mobilized, and what our potential responses could be. My argument here is that a robust analysis of the historical moment allows us pathways out of what appears to be an intractable, despairing moment. The second point that I really want to focus on today is really to examine some historical exemplars from South Africa in which race has been surfaced in strategic relations of power and resisted in the Foucauldian sense, and how these do not simply reflect an unmetabolized, unprocessed, untransformed repetition compulsion, to borrow metaphorically from Freud, but actually represent incremental gains for the anti-racist project over time, acknowledging, of course, that we may not reach levels of imagined or fantasized resolution to the race question, but also finding paradoxical hope in the idea that it is not necessarily seeing an end to race, that it is in not necessarily seeing an end to race, that this also serves as a driver to seek such an end. Again, the point here is that the histories of combative and adversarial critical race theorizing and practices are not despairing and static returns to the status quo. Finally, I'd want to say and speak to the alternative ways of approaching questions of race that extend beyond the boundary of blackness and whiteness, that are in constant opposition to each other. By examining race as central to defining the modern conception of what it means to be human, and how such an argument opens up the possibilities for engaging race differently and tackling some of the challenges and questions of post-race societies and the intersections of race with neoliberalism. So, to start off, I want to talk a little bit about the morbidities of our time. And I want to quote from Gramsci, and Gramsci's prison notebooks in the 1930s or so. He suggests that the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Of course, Gramsci was appropriating the term that was normally utilized to define the period of political transfer of power from one monarch to another, but nevertheless utilized it to describe the extraordinary situations in which the extant legal frame of social order loses its grip and can hold no longer, whereas a new frame made to the measure of newly emerged conditions, responsible for making the old frame useless, is still at the designing stage, has not yet been fully assembled, or is not strong enough to be put in its place. A period where one arrangement of hegemony is waning, but prior to the emergence of another, so to speak. Now, this has been a rather lengthy interregnum, many of us would say, especially if we consider decolonial theorists' arguments about race being central to the colonizing turn in both the North and the West. The paradigm of discovery and newness that also included the gradual propagation of capitalism, racism, and the modern system of gender inequality. The rise of modernity converged with European expansionism, slavery and colonialism, and race and violence were central to its birthing and to the naturalization of racial alterity over the next 500 years. But in returning to our more recent histories, there's perhaps been waves of political formations and social movements that have rolled across so many diverse contexts in the world today, often explicitly and sometimes implicitly activating and relying upon deeply racialized binaries that we had once imagined had been vanquished, albeit sometimes replaced by more nuanced and mutated forms of symbolic or cultural racism on the one hand, anti-racist and non-racist lexicons at least on the other. We've witnessed the shock of a Trump victory that actively mobilized against marginalized others and minorities. We've seen the apparent voting against self-interests in Brexit that seemingly revealed a deep xenophobia in the UK. And Europe has seen its fair share of anti-immigrant political entrepreneurship in Marine Le Pen's National Front in France, Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, and of course Frauke Petry and Alexander Gauland's Alternative for Germany party. Islamophobia has been on the rise since 9/11, but we also observe political Islam deploying similar popular strategies. We see the rise in both black and white nationalism, and closer to home, we've witnessed calls for nationalization, returns to ethnic essentialism, and of course the catastrophic events involving Bill Pottinger's mobilization of the discourse of white monopoly capital. Of course, in the present period, we are also witnessing an array of organic social movements that have vented discontent and resisted the unprecedented and unfettered global levels of exploitation, marginalisation and inequality. Cutting a swath across a range of social contexts, these sustained impulses have been characterised by calls for decolonising education, science, language, the canon, the economy and social institutions. This contemporary decolonial moment has birthed striking exemplars such as Black Lives Matter, Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, landless peoples movements across Africa, and emerging political formations amongst the precariat in Latin America and parts of Asia. But of course, it's extended beyond this as well. In such a fractious context, it will be important to find the analytic tools that offer us some way of overcoming the paralysis of there is no alternative, Tina, but simultaneously avoid the ahistorical claims that there are simply infinite possibilities out of the current morbidities, by examining both the contemporary conditions of possibility and the historical crucible from which these moments emerge. So I want to talk about this question of despair very briefly. For writers such as Humphreys and Mayer, there is of course a profound historical shift taking place, characterized by the decline in the mass-based politics that persisted for much of the 20th century. This anti-politics that they refer to has two distinct but related expressions or forms. Firstly, there's the prevailing popular mood of detachment from and hostility towards politicians, parties, and the political process, including radical forms of politics. This expresses itself in short-lived bursts of protest, electoral volatility, and political crisis, but tends to dissipate if not given direction. Secondly, there are political projects from across the ideological spectrum that trade on an appeal to this mood for their own political ends. On the right, we've witnessed the likes of Trumpism and Brexit, but on the left, parties like Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain have related to the sentiment, mobilizing widespread disenchantment with politicians and the political process, and vowing to do a different kind of politics. Now, rather than simply analyzing these movements as a pathologization of the citizenry as racist, conservative, populist, etc., we should not ignore the dissolution of the social base of long-standing political arrangements, a breakdown of the social compact between old political orders and the citizenry, especially around matters of race, where whiteness was ensconced beneath a veneer or the patina of decency, as Ta-Nehisi Coates refers to it in the USA. Coates suggests that simply blaming the white working class under those circumstances as a group of thoughtless bigots and racists is a low-hanging fruit, analytically speaking, that does not jeopardize the hegemonic intellectual project, and belies the fact that whiteness, white supremacy, and white privilege have been at the heart of the USA as a social and economic project. While black slavery, indentured labor, and working class conditions have been the norm for the USA, the same cannot be said for whites. However, in moments of relative economic prosperity, this possibility was staved off. But as austerity gripped the social formation, the return to the foundational values of the USA, supremacy, privilege, and prosperity, all of course tied to notions of the nation, was an easy rebound possibility for the likes of Trump and others. The point he makes is that rather than viewing the current circumstances as a mere reflection of an unthinking citizenry, it is in fact a reflection of the systemic bigotry that has been revealed by stripping away this patina of decency covering whiteness, and that has been weaponized both literally and figuratively. Now, this is important for South Africa because, of course, there are elements of populist tactics and strategies on both the right and the left of the political spectrum that have reverberated throughout society. Whilst these moments allow for the possibility of a radical shift in our politics and our actions as citizens and institutions, we should always be mindful that populism can also open up spaces for race being deployed in the service of racial projects that Omi and Monant refer to: anti-intellectualism, pragmatism, authoritarianism, repression, and the suppression of ideas and peoples. However, I think it would be an analytic error to once more think about those constituencies being mobilized as unthinking political cannon fodder with a false consciousness, whether on the left or the right. Calls for free, quality, decolonized education also reflect long-standing challenges around access to education, a pivotal site which is considered a proxy by many to mean access to the economy. Likewise, the question of land expropriation without compensation, irrespective of the technicist arguments about whether the land is arable, whether it is likely to be optimally utilized, etc., are both real manifestations of a desire to be involved in an agrarian economy on the one hand, but also is a symbolic signal and desire for historical restitution and belonging in a country, all that have not been adequately addressed in the transformation agenda over the last 2.5 decades. And this is important because I think an analysis of this nature allows us to think about the way that some of the current ways or manifestations of the politics of race in South Africa have in fact been incubated by us ourselves. On the other side, of course, discourses and practices of white protectionism continue to reveal how the loss of political and class privilege remains met by resistances. But also our whiteness in South Africa was also historically premised on coalescing around notions of threat, ironically generating the perfect storm in which white loss is also associated with white threat perception and the consolidation and reappearance of earlier modes of white nationalism that are all too easily projected into the other, unthinking white, rather than being seen as core to the history of whiteness and our social formation. Here too then in South Africa, ongoing analytics of the current historical moment also illuminate the extent to which the ideology of racial tolerance that Slavoj Žižek refers to, that was inaugurated through processes such as the TRC and its attendant discourses of reconciliation and rainbow nationalism, continues to be exposed for the race-class illusions that it has and continues to contribute to. We have to be careful to avoid the pitfalls of analytic hubris, where the simplest explanations are turned to, which do not jeopardize our own historical intellectual projects, as these are sites of despair that are also ironically the sites of refuge for unreflexive intellectuals. So I want to perhaps talk a little bit about race in South Africa and this notion that actually a repetition has left us at a place of an impasse or a malaise around race. So I talk here about the race making of and resistance to segregation in South Africa because I think there's a historical set of exemplars that are quite useful here. Perhaps understandably, given our history of racialized excess with all of its accoutrements under apartheid, there remains a deeply binary preoccupation with race at many levels in South Africa at present. This includes questions pertaining to whether we should continue to use the racial labels, for redress in the service of more equitable resource distribution as ways of thinking about social relations, essential to election politics, to rethink the post-apartheid distributional regime in the context of employment equity or affirmative action, black economic empowerment, etc., etc. The list is endless. This preoccupation has often left many South Africans feeling a malaise about the apparent impasse in moving beyond the fixity of such binaries in post-apartheid South Africa. But as indicated, I will argue that such fixities are themselves constructions that belie the complicated nature of the race subject, both historically and in contemporary social reality. To return to the Freudian metaphor referred to earlier on, these instantiations may appear as forms of repetition compulsion, or as a return of the repressed, so to speak. This is by no means a new position, as has been argued by the likes of David Goldberg in his book The Threat of Race, in how the anti-racial project has collapsed in on itself in the service of reinscribing racial hierarchies, and to a lesser extent can also be read